August 7th, 1961, in the basement of Lindsay Chittenham Hall at Yale University, a grand human experiment is being conducted. The man behind this controversial experiment was known as Stanley Milgram. Milgram devised this psychological study to explain the psychology of genocide. What could cause a perfectly normal and innocent person to deliberately harm or even kill another innocent person? Participants were told they were helping to train a subject's memory. The participants were encouraged to administer potentially deadly electrical shocks to the subjects as a sort of training aid. They were told that the experiment was to see if punishment improves memory. But this was just a cover story for the true study, which is a dive into our ability to obey an authority figure even to the point of murder. This is the Milgram Experiment. Stanley Milgram, an American social psychologist born in New York on the 15th of August 1933. His parents were Jewish and fled Germany in the Second World War. Although he lived in the United States, many of his family members were directly affected by the Holocaust. He wanted to know what caused a large portion of the people in a modern country like Germany to be complicit in committing heinous crimes against people that had been their neighbours for years. Milgram's family going through the Holocaust and the arrest and trial of Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem sparked his interest in the experiment. Eichmann facilitated the logistics involved in the mass deportation of millions of Jews to ghettos and extermination camps in Nazi-occupied Europe in World War II. He also determined how the properties of other deported Jews would be seized. During the trial, he claimed he had not dictated the policies, but he was just following orders. Could it be that Eichmann and his millions of accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders? Or should we be calling them all accomplices? The experiment involved 3 people at a time. The experimenter, who was in charge of the session, the teacher, who was a random volunteer, and a learner. Both the teacher and learner would arrive at the same time. The participants were found via newspaper advertising and believed they were taking part in a study about learning. After the 2 participants arrived, they would draw lots to find out who would be the learner and who would be the teacher. But the draw was faked, so the volunteer participants would always get the role of teacher, and the learner was a hired actor pretending to be a volunteer participant. At this point, the learner would be taken into a room and strapped to an electric chair with an electrode attached to their arm. The teacher would witness all of this, while the experimenter, dressed in a lab coat, explained the situation to them. The teacher would then be given a sample 15-volt electric shock, similar to what the learner would feel, before the teacher and experimenter would be taken to a room next door, which contained an electric shock generator with 30 switches that delivered from 15 volts, which was a slight shock, to 450 volts, which is enough to kill a human being. We're pretty sure the like button is safe though, but better check it just in case though. The learner would be given a list of paired words to learn, and after learning them, the teacher would test him by calling out a word and asking the learner to recall the word's partner from a list of 4 possible choices. The teacher was told to administer an electric shock every time the learner made a mistake, and the teacher was told to increase it by 15 volts every time. Since the learner was actually a hired actor, he would give wrong answers on purpose. But of course, the teacher didn't know this. When the teacher refused to administer an electric shock, the experimenter would give a series of orders to ensure the teacher continues to administer the shocks. When the voltage got too high, the learner would be shouting and shrieking in pain while audibly struggling in their restraints until they stopped and went quiet as if dead. In later variations of the experiment, they had the learner plead for mercy or plead for their life as they had a heart condition. The voltage ranged from 15 to 450 volts and was labelled slight shock, medium shock, and at 350 volts, danger severe shock. Above 400 volts, the learner would kick on the wall and no longer give audible answers. After the experiment, an interview would be undertaken, and the question, "How painful do you think the last shock you administered was asked. The experiment began in July 1901, and up to 40 subjects volunteered, and the results were surprising. Before the experiment, it was predicted that only a small percentage of the participants would administer the high voltage shocks. But as the results would show, this prediction was way off. Of the 40 subjects, all of them reached 300 volts, at which point the learner would bang on the wall and stop answering. Of those, 5 refused to go beyond this point. The rest exceeded the 380 volts marked intense shock, and 26 proceeded all of the way to 450 volts. At this point, the subjects would think the learner is dead. Although most of the teachers showed signs of discomfort and stress, they still obeyed the perceived authority of a guy in a white lab coat, even to the point of murder. And there was no punishment for disobeying the experimenter, nor was there any reward for completing the experiment, as payment was done at the start. Strangely enough, the experiment has been repeated many times, even with unpaid students still yielding a strikingly similar result, up to 65% compliance to the highest voltage level. Was the experiment ethical? As controversial as this experiment was, it is open to debate as to whether this experiment was ethical or not. Either way, it was a fascinating dive into the nature of humanity.